Shalom, welcome to Practical Spirituality here in Asia Torah, in the old city of Jerusalem overlooking the Temple Mount. Right now we're discussing intellectual versus mystical Judaism. They seem to be quite kind of opposite traditions, and you often meet more Jews that are intellectual and less Jews that are of the more mystical types. It turns out that originally every Jew that was intellectual was mystical. They were the same guy. It was like one-stop shop when it came to these things, meaning whoever was the wisest Jew, meaning he had the most information of the oral tradition, he was also the same person who had the most intense mystical facts. We got a couple more guys in here. We got any more chairs back there in here? Oh, good. You got a chair? That's amazing. So just shut that door. Anyway, they if he knew the most, he was also the most mystically oriented. Now, can I just mention something that a lot of us don't think about? And that is leadership in Israel has always been a double thing, meaning biblically. It was a king and it was a prophet. The king he wasn't necessarily the biggest scholar in the world, and he wasn't necessarily the most spiritual guy in the world, but he was a king, always from the tribe of Judah. And then there was a prophet who was the most learned, and he was the most spiritual. And he would basically call the shots regarding the big stuff. When they needed to ask really big stuff, there was the high priest had a breastplate that had crystals on it. 12 different precious stones. Each precious stone had one of the names of the tribes on it, and you could actually ask it questions, and it would answer you, which is really weird. But you could ask the stones questions, and they would give you answers of national importance. Like, you don't mess with that thing unless it's really important. You're not supposed to, you don't just ask like things about the stock market or anything like that, which we can talk about later with David. Anyway, what'd you ask?
How did it give you answers?
I don't know how it answered exactly.
Morse code with the lights?
It was something with lights. They were lighting up and stuff. Yeah, it was pretty cool. And anyway, it used to be that the most learned people were the most spiritual people. But the other thing is they were leading us. And what we've got today is what are we supposed to do? We have to look to the scholars to lead us. But they don't necessarily have the mystical tradition, meaning there are those who have the mystical tradition and they can look at you and just tell you like everyone you've been in, every incarnation that you've had. There were people there was a Jew in Jerusalem when I got here. There was the last living Jew on earth that used to be able to do this. There were many at one point. He was I think it was a Yemenite in a bookshop in the Bukharin quarter. Did you ever get to, you know what I'm talking about? Did you ever get to meet him? I never got to meet him. But you wait in line at the bookshop. He's the guy whose bookshop it is. No one ever bought a book, I don't think, because everyone just wanted to know who they were in a previous life. And he would just look at you and tell you who you were in lifetimes. There were people who could read beards. Beards tell a whole story. Like, I guess they could. Then there's plenty of people who can read faces, which helps if you're a woman. It's a little hard to read your beard. But people can read faces. But there was these kinds of people were guiding Israel. Today you have scholars guiding Israel, which is wonderful. We do need to know a lot of details, and thank God we got people with incredible clarity whose minds have been literally honed by Torah in such a way that they think like no one else in the world. There's two reasons why Jews have always been at the top of the fields of most things. One is that they have an 115 average IQ, which is absolutely and totally unheard of on our planet. It is one entire index above the rest of the planet, and that's just weird. I mean, that things like that shouldn't exist on our planet. But Jews are at 115 average IQ, which is just figure that out. Like, how'd that happen? That's one reason why Jews wind up at the top of every industry, because every industry is a hierarchy of competence. And someone with a very high IQ is going to be very competent. And they're going to rise to the competence. They're going to rise the competence ladder. However, obviously there's other things that don't require that intellectual competence. They require more instinctual competence. Like, for example, sports, art, counseling. It's not going to be, no one here like wants to go speak to someone who's really smart. They want to speak to someone who's really hard. Yeah, when they're going to get counseled, and with a lot of intuition in that process. So that's a different kind of person. Anyway, but yeah, Jews have those numbers. But the other thing that Jews have is that they have brains that have been honed by Talmudic study. Talmudic study basically takes away the cobwebs in our thinking. It is very, very, very hard to follow a line of Talmudic study. And it could go on for pages. And it could also get interrupted because the Talmud thinks like your mind on sativa. meaning it's a new subject every 30 seconds. There's a new subject that gets dealt with. And then another one. So the Talmud could follow a line for quite some time, diverge into some really crazy sci-fi type story for a while, which is really only there for Kabbalistic reasons, meaning for us to understand deeper stuff. And then it shoots right back to the story. And your brain's got to stay right where that story is. Otherwise, right where the point was before the story, because otherwise you're going to have to go review it's kind of like I don't know what that game was. It was like it was called a pachinko machine where the ball goes shooting up and it comes through all these channels of little pegs that were in the thing. Pinball, right? Pinball is kind of a version of that, I suppose. But it's just ball coming down the vertical thing, and anyway, our minds get honed in by that. In fact, I even make a THC challenge. It's called the THC challenge, which is that all the people who are smoking cannabis, whose brains don't think Talmudically, so if they learn 10 pages of Talmud by heart in English, you don't have to deal with the Hebrew, just in English. If you can follow the argument for 10 straight pages and memorize the argument, that not only will there be no more effects of any overuse of THC, but they will be thinking in ways they never ever dreamed that they could think. And that's the mind on Talmud. Now, when you hear about Jews rising to the tops of industry, it's two things. One is the IQ thing, but the other thing is that usually when you hear these great names, they were usually born into very observant yeshiva families. Very observant yeshiva families. Like, for example, Karl Marx grew up in yeshiva. Albert Einstein grew up also in yeshiva. What was that other guy's name?
Bob Dylan.
What?
Bob Dylan was.
Oh wait! Einstein was not raised in yeshiva, but in a full Yiddish world. So like everyone raising him was thinking that in these terms.
Ben Shapiro.
Ben Shapiro was raised in yeshiva. He was raised in yeshiva. He's a smart guy. But the thing is, what happens is if these people drop out of Judaism with that IQ and those brains, they're going to head to the tops of industries automatically. They're just going to see through. They're going to thread the needle through all of that industry and get to the top of it. And sadly, because many of them have dropped Torah, they don't have the moral voice, which can wind up blowing up into a kind of a desecration of God's name, because everyone knows the guy's Jewish, but now he's up to no good, So we never like it when Jews are in the news, when it's the rich and famous, powerful types who have misused their power because they were not guided by Torah, and they didn't have a mentor who was a rabbinic figure, and so that's when trouble hit. Speaking of having a mentor, rabbinic figure, there's a famous story of the head of Starbucks, who was a Jewish man. What's his name? Howard Schultz. He met with the Rosh Yeshiva, the Mir Yeshiva, the biggest yeshiva in the world. He met with the Rosh Yeshiva there. He's the CEO of Starbucks. And he met with him, and he asked the rabbi what the lesson of the Holocaust was. Like, what lesson does he want him to get from the Holocaust? So he said that the lesson was that when there were like 5 people on a little wood bed, there was no way to survive the night without dying. There was only one blanket. So, and this guy pulls that way. If you were on the ends, you weren't going to live that night. I mean, freezing temperatures, one blanket. And so what the Jews discovered was if they all kind of pile up together, they could get the blanket to cover everybody. And you might have a very uncomfortable night of sleep, but you at least are alive, and so is the guy next to you. And so that's how they lived. And so he said to Schultz, he said, with your wealth, God has given you a blanket. Make sure you're covering everybody. That's what he said to him. But imagine every wealthy person was getting that kind of mentoring going on. Speaking of which, tonight's the night where my mentor teaches. He's this great Kabbalistic person who lives very reclusively. It's almost impossible to get to him unless you'll be in my van tonight at 10:30 at 52 Shmuel Hanavi. Or I can swing by the Old City if that helps anybody. Old City swing by. So I'll swing by Jaffa Gate.
It's only for guys.
Around, yeah, he has Shabbos guests who are female, but tonight's the Kabbalistic Journey. You have to be born Jewish to be in there, because he's teaching some of the secrets that a Gentile's not allowed to hear. So he won't teach it to people who are not Jewish, and if they're in the process of converting, they have to come after they finish their conversion process. Converts are great. He has plenty of converts hanging around. Yeah. Anyway, but he's like the great Merlin of Israel, and we're going to be with him tonight. I'm going to come by Jaffa Gate around 10:30 in my van. We have to go out to the mountains where he lives. Yeah. Okay. Now, for us, what are we supposed to do? And the answer is, we are all. I mean, what do you think you should focus on? The intellectual property of Torah or the mystical property of Torah? Which one? Both. But what if you had to choose between the two?
Intellectual.
If you had to choose between the two, which one? Mystical. Okay, all in favor of the mystical, raise your hand. I'm asking which one's not right. I'm asking which one's right, not which one you want. Yeah, which one would be the right one if you only had time to choose one? Okay, all in favor of the mystical, raise your hand. Everyone's got to vote. All in favor of the intellectual, raise your hand. Okay, you almost got it. So the answer is, depends if you're male or female. If you're female, then it would be more important to study the mystical tradition. If you're male, then, and you only have time for one or the other, then you should be studying the intellectual tradition. What's the difference?
Yeah.
Well, if you're studying the mystical tradition, you're going to be connecting yourself deeply to God.
What's the difference between...
Really deeply.
Excuse me, for men or women?
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's because the men have an obligation of Torah study. That's a commandment in the Torah. Now, we also have a commandment to cleave to God, which you have a commandment both ways. But we have to, because we run households, meaning we are the voice of Torah in our homes. So you can't even get, no offense to anyone not raised observant, but you can't even get near the dating pool of observant women without Torah knowledge. Like, because they don't have that level of detail in their upbringing and in their studies. They don't get that level of detail. They're counting on their husbands to know all that stuff. So if you're male in this class, you want to know more of the intellectual property and spend your times like Thursday nights, like we're going to, in Shabbat, and maybe other late nights learning the mystical tradition. But the meat and potatoes of your day should be spent on the intellectual study, so that you have knowledge, so that not only can you get married, but once you're married, your home has a Torah base to it. And your wife can count on your knowledge. What?
And the relevancy for women then? Like for them to study the mystical side?
Yeah, well, that's what we're here for. We're here to connect to God. And so since you can rely on your husband's, halachic ability to figure out things in the house, your job's to be the most spiritual person anyone ever met. Every single girl in this room has to be the most spiritual person that anyone ever met. And all the guys in this room, you have to be the most spiritual person anyone ever met, and you got to know a lot of Torah. You got to know a lot of Torah. And so it's a pretty big obligation. It's a pretty big obligation, but I have a feeling, let's get a show of your hand. I'm not going to put the camera on y'all, but how many of you dedicate, I don't know, what would be called, how much do you think the average Jew, from just your experience since you've been here for a little while, how many hours would you say a Jew should spend on a week focused solely on the mystical traditions? Out of 7 days, how many hours would you give it? A fully observant Jew should be spending.
Maybe like 6 to 8 hours a day.
No, we have to study the. We also study the laws and the intellectual stuff. How much would you say, Brad?
Maybe 2 to 3 hours a day.
What would you say?
20 hours a week.
20 hours a week. On the mystical?
10 minutes a day.
10 minutes a day.
I think a man is not supposed to learn mystical tradition until they're at least 40.
No, there's specific there's just specific stuff you're not supposed to learn. We're not talking about cleaving to God. Every man has a commandment to cleave to God, and he's going to have to learn a lot of mystical traditions to do that.
To have your emotional, is a mystical connection meaning an emotional connection to God? You should be 100% of your time.
I like the way you said that. That's very nice, but there is a lot of study that's necessary to up it beyond just the emotion, like into the mystical tradition of Judaism. I mean, we have a massive tradition. Yeah. I mean, the most famous mystical tradition is called Kabbalah in general, but there's that's broken into like book after book after book after book after book after book. A lot of oral tradition in the Kabbalah. It eventually got put in layman's terms, which makes it really easy on us, which is called Chassidut, the books of Chassidut. And there's also writings of other stuff, the Ramchal, the Vilna Gaon, and many greats of Rishonim wrote. There's a lot of great traditions there. And that stuff, we have to know that stuff. Okay, here we go. Raise your hand if you spend 5 hours a week doing that. 5 hours a week doing it. Yes, Noah's hands up. Very good, Noah. 4 hours a week. 3 hours a week on mystical traditions.
What are you talking about? What we think or what we do?
No, you're studying mystical traditions or in practice.
This is outside of school on your own.
Yeah, on your own.
Wait, how do you do it?
Sure. 3 hours a week?
What if you do it more?
She's on the 3 hour week. 2 hours a week? Nice, 2 hours a week. 1 hour a week. 1 hour a week, very good.
What if you do it more than 5?
You raise your hand at the beginning. Okay. Anyway, the bottom line is, as you all could see, almost very few people raise their hands, and we have to know this stuff. We got to know this stuff now.
But I have a question.
Yeah.
Then, if you're saying that everyone should know like mystical Torah or whatever it is, but there's like a whole group of people who are like called misnagdim against like that type of learning. So why?
They're not really against it.
Like, so then why is that like a division? Well, one of the divisions.
Why is there like Hasidim Misnagdim?
Yeah.
What happened was just to tell you a brief history, used to be everyone knew everything, meaning everyone knew both the mystical and the intellectual. And what happened was there was a false messiah about 400 years ago. Mm-hmm. You guys ever heard about the false messiah? You heard of him? Shabtai Tzvi?
Yeah.
You can look it up, it's crazy. But there was a false messiah who was using the mystical tradition to like wow everybody, and he made this whole messianic thing, and it just totally like fell apart and was a terrible, ended badly. And so what happened was there were people who went against the mystical tradition, or at least wanted to lock it up amongst the scholarship only, like top level scholars are allowed in, no one else. And that was called the Misnagdim. At first it was everybody, but what happened was, maybe I'll say it like this. There became this, it was called the rationalist movement. It was a rational period in Jewish history. It didn't last that long because within 100 years of it, there were these masters of Kabbalah who disagreed with it and said that we need to bring, if like the intellectual side of Torah is the meat and potatoes, the Kabbalah is like the gravy. And so there were Kabbalists who said, high-level Kabbalists who were not Hasidic, who said, hey, we got to bring it back. And so they brought it back, and that became known as the Hasidic tradition. And then the ones who said we should not bring it back, i.e. the Misnagdim, those are the ones who said we should not bring it back, we should let it remain amongst the scholars. They're not against it. They're just saying let it stay at the top of the tower of the Torah scholarship. And they were never against it. Some of the greatest Kabbalists ever lived were from that camp. While the Hasidim had this far reach of like trickling it back into the Jewish world. They were just putting the gravy back onto the meat. You know, sometimes people pour gravy onto meat that dried up and, you know, serve it again. You know, and that's what Hasidus is, just reserved food that got its wetness back, became moist again. And that's all. And I understand both sides of the argument. They both, you know, they both make some sense. But anyway, that's how that went. And so the Hasidim, that's who now today, I mean, the word Hasidim doesn't have anything to do with the Hasidic movement today. I know people who have nothing to do with Hasidim, are the biggest Hasidim I ever met. And I know people who are total Hasidim who don't know the first thing about Hasidus. And so today Hasidim's it's a community identification. You know? Yeah, it's a community identification. But living Hasidim, I live in a non-Hasidic neighborhood that's, you know, it's a whole courtyard of non-Hasidic people. These people are way bigger Hasidim than most of the Hasidim I know. They're real Hasidim, these guys. And they're not, but they're not card-carrying member of the community of Hasidim that I'm part of. They're non-Hasidim who are very Hasidic in their approach. Deep meditators into the mystical tradition, extremely learned into Kabbalah of all ages. Yeah. I gave a whole list before. Let's go down to the next question. It's on Facebook and YouTube and all those good things. And Torah anytime. Okay.